Everyone thought Sophie Cunningham was leaving the Indiana Fever. Not quietly. Not maybe. Definitely. The league prepared for it. Expansion teams circled her name. Fans accepted it as inevitable. Even the math said she was gone. And that's what made what happened next so jarring. Because there was no dramatic announcement, no headline-grabbing post, no formal declaration that flipped the narrative. Instead, Sophie did something far more unsettling for people who thought they had this story figured out. She stayed. And not in the passive. We'll see what happens way people expected. She stayed with intention. With clarity. With conviction. The kind that instantly exposes how wrong the entire conversation had been from the start. Because this was never just about free agency. It was about power, identity, and what happens when a league grows faster than its assumptions. And once you understand why everyone was so sure she was leaving, the reversal becomes even more revealing. From the outside, Sophie Cunningham's exit didn't just seem likely. It felt logical. The Indiana Fever were walking straight into an expansion draft, the kind that forces hard decisions even well-run teams hate making. Protection slots were limited. The Fever's core was already crowded. Caitlin Clark was untouchable. Aaliyah Boston wasn't going anywhere. Kelsey Mitchell's value was undeniable. Lexi Hull had carved out a role the organization trusted. Add in rookie contracts and long-term planning, and suddenly the math started to squeeze. And Sophie, she sat right at the intersection of value and vulnerability. Too important to casually lose. Too expensive to casually protect. Too visible to quietly ignore. That's the trap expansion drafts create. Teams don't just ask who they love. They ask who they can afford to risk. And Sophie Cunningham, despite everything she brought on the floor and off it, kept landing in that dangerous mental category. The odd one out. Around the league, front offices noticed. Expansion teams noticed. They didn't see uncertainty. They saw opportunity. A proven player, peak visibility, playoff experience, and a personality that moves fans. That combination doesn't sit unclaimed for long. So when people started saying, she's gone, it wasn't rumor. It was inference. The kind built from roster spreadsheets, contract structures, and precedent. In WNBA circles, those signals usually don't lie. But what those calculations missed was the one variable that never fits cleanly on a protection list. And that was Sophie herself. Because while the league was running numbers, Sophie was quietly reshaping the story in ways no expansion draft could predict. And that's where things started to shift. What made the assumption of Sophie Cunningham's exit feel so airtight wasn't just roster math. It was her own words, or at least how people chose to interpret them. Near the end of the season, Sophie didn't shut down speculation. She didn't rush to clarify. In exit interviews, podcast appearances, and casual comments, she left space. She talked about options, about timing, about how quickly things change in this league. To fans hungry for answers, that openness sounded like distance. To analysts, it sounded like leverage. To expansion teams, it sounded like an invitation. In a league where players are increasingly careful with their messaging, ambiguity is rarely accidental. And Sophie's ambiguity was read as strategy. People started connecting dots that seemed obvious. Why wouldn't she test the market? Why wouldn't she listen to offers when expansion franchises were desperate for credibility and stars? Why wouldn't she consider a situation where she could be a centerpiece instead of a variable in a crowded core? And then there was the visibility factor. Sophie's profile had exploded. Playing next to Caitlin Clark didn't just boost ratings. It turned every Fever game into an event. Social media numbers jumped. Interviews multiplied. Fans who had never followed her career suddenly knew her name, her personality, her edge. For a league still learning how to convert momentum into money, Sophie became the kind of player teams build campaigns around. That level of exposure usually leads to movement. It's how careers scale. It's how players cash in on timing. So when Sophie didn't rush to say, "I'm staying," the silence spoke louder than any statement could. The assumption hardened. The narrative settled. People stopped asking if she was leaving and started asking where. But what most people didn't realize was that while everyone else was projecting forward, Sophie was looking backward. Back to something that mattered more than leverage. More than expansion money. More than being the face of a new franchise. And once that clicked, the story everyone thought they understood began to unravel. Because the next signal didn't come from a rumor. It came from home. When Sophie Cunningham finally spoke plainly, the tone was different. Not calculated. Not cautious. Grounded. The setting mattered. It wasn't a flashy press conference or a national platform. It was Missouri, the Sophie Cunningham Classic, a girls' basketball event built around giving back, not shaping headlines. And that context made the message hit harder, because nothing about it felt rehearsed for leverage. She talked about the Midwest like someone who never stopped carrying it with her. About roots, familiar faces, the comfort of being close to the people who knew her before the spotlight did. That's not the language of a player looking to maximize a market window. That's the language of someone who values stability when everything else feels uncertain. And uncertainty was everywhere. The CBA was unresolved. Expansion teams were forming without clarity. Roster rules were shifting. For most players, that chaos is a reason to chase flexibility. For Sophie, it was the opposite. It made familiarity matter more. She didn't frame Indiana as a stepping stone. She framed it as alignment. When she called the Fever a blessing, it wasn't PR. She talked about pace, about style, about how the way Indiana plays actually fits how she sees the game. That's a subtle but important distinction. Players can adapt anywhere. Thriving is different. Sophie wasn't talking about minutes or money. She was talking about rhythm. Then came the part that flipped everything. She didn't say she hoped to return. She didn't say she was open to staying. She spoke as if she already belonged there. That shift caught people off guard because it contradicted months of buildup. But in hindsight, the signs were there. Her energy never disconnected. Her relationships never cooled. The jokes on social media. The familiarity with the locker room. None of it looked like someone mentally checking out. The truth is, Sophie never announced she was leaving. The league announced it for her. And once she reclaimed the narrative, the free agency frenzy around her lost its center. But there was still one question left hanging. One that mattered more than comfort, loyalty, or even fit. Because choosing Indiana wasn't just an emotional decision. It was a basketball decision. And that choice came with real risk. Choosing Indiana wasn't the safe move. It just felt like one. From the outside, staying with the Fever looks comfortable. Familiar system. Familiar teammates. A city that embraced her. But inside league circles, there was a quieter conversation happening. One that had nothing to do with vibes or loyalty. It was about timing. The WNBA isn't in a stable phase right now. It's in motion. Expansion teams are coming in hungry, willing to overpay, willing to build identities around a single face. New markets don't just want contributors. They want anchors. Sophie Cunningham could have walked into that role immediately. Fresh jersey. Fresh narrative. A franchise built around her voice and her edge. Indiana doesn't offer that kind of control. In Indiana, the spotlight doesn't belong to one person anymore. It's shared. Caitlin Clark pulls gravity. Aaliyah Boston commands respect. Kelsey Mitchell still owns big moments. Staying means accepting that no matter how important you are part of something bigger, not the headline of it. For some players, that's a deal breaker. For Sophie, it wasn't. But that doesn't mean the risk disappeared. It just changed shape. There's the expansion draft reality. Protection limits don't care about loyalty. Front offices still have to make cold decisions with limited slots. Even players who want to stay can find themselves exposed through no fault of their own. That reality hasn't gone away, no matter how clear Sophie's intentions are. Then there's the injury factor. Sophie didn't hide it. She acknowledged rehab. She acknowledged the process. That honesty matters, but it also raises stakes. Choosing stability while your body is recovering is a gamble. If things go sideways, expansion teams won't wait. Indiana might not have flexibility. The league moves fast when health becomes a question. And yet she stayed. That tells you something about how she sees her value. Not as a piece to be auctioned. Not as a short-term asset. But as a part of a core she believes in. That belief becomes even more interesting when you look at who she chose to align with long-term. Because staying in Indiana isn't just about the city. It's about the people. And that's where this story gets deeper. If this were only about contracts, Sophie Cunningham probably would have left. Money talks loudly in a league where windows are short and security isn't guaranteed. Expansion teams can promise bigger roles, louder branding, and cleaner slates. But none of that replaces something players rarely admit matters just as much. Trust. Inside the Indiana Fever locker room, that trust wasn't theoretical. It was built in real moments. Injuries piling up, rotations shifting, pressure increasing as expectations exploded. When things got unstable, certain players didn't disappear. They absorbed it. That's why Sophie keeps bringing up Kelsey Mitchell. Not casually. Not as a throwaway compliment. Every time Sophie mentions Kelsey, it's with intention. When multiple starters went down, Mitchell carried the load without noise. No public frustration. No subtle shots. Just production. Just leadership. For players like Sophie, that matters more than any pitch a new franchise can make. Then there's Lexi Hull. Their connection isn't just chemistry on the floor, it's rhythm off it. Shared roles. Shared sacrifice. The kind of teammate who understands spacing, effort, and defensive responsibility without needing it spelled out. That kind of understanding doesn't come from training camp. It comes from repetition and mutual respect. And of course, Caitlin Clark. This is where outsiders get it wrong. People assume playing next to a generational star means shrinking. In reality, it does the opposite for the right players. Caitlin bends defenses in ways the WNBA hasn't seen before. That pressure creates space. Space creates opportunity. Opportunity rewards players who know how to move, shoot, and react without hesitation. Sophie fits that mold perfectly. She doesn't need the ball to matter. She doesn't need plays drawn for her to impact games. She thrives in chaos, quick reads, broken possessions, moments when instincts take over. Playing next to Caitlin doesn't mute her game. It amplifies it. And that dynamic isn't accidental. According to people close to the team, that trio didn't just coexist. They talked. They adjusted. They aligned on what the Fever could be instead of what they were expected to be. That shared vision, winning, not branding, changed how Sophie evaluated her future. Expansion teams can offer spotlight. Indiana offered belief. But chemistry alone doesn't keep a player when the league starts shifting under everyone's feet. Because just as Sophie was committing emotionally, the WNBA itself was entering one of its most uncertain chapters yet. And that uncertainty made her decision even louder. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Sophie Cunningham didn't make this decision in a stable league environment. She made it while everything felt unsettled. The WNBA is standing in the middle of a pressure point. Expansion drafts, new franchises, shifting power dynamics, and a looming CBA that nobody can fully predict. Players aren't just choosing teams anymore. They're choosing risk profiles. For a lot of veterans, this moment screams move now. New teams mean fresh contracts. Fresh contracts mean leverage. And leverage disappears fast in a league where roster spots can evaporate overnight. That's what makes Sophie's choice stand out. She didn't follow the safest financial logic. She followed the most controlled one. Indiana isn't just a team anymore. It's a known environment, a system, a culture she understands. She knows how the staff communicates. She knows how minutes are earned. She knows how mistakes are handled. That stability becomes priceless when everything else feels shaky. And then there's the CBA cloud hanging over everything. Nobody knows exactly what the next agreement will look like. Salaries, protections, roster structures, none of it is guaranteed. For players rehabbing injuries or managing long-term where uncertainty is dangerous. One wrong move, one bad fit, and leverage disappears. That's why Sophie addressing her injury publicly mattered. She didn't hide it. She didn't downplay it with fake optimism. She acknowledged it, explained that rehab was going well, and framed it as part of a longer arc, not an obstacle. That signals confidence, not just in her body, but in the environment she's healing inside. Indiana gave her time. Indiana gave her support. Indiana didn't rush her back for optics. Expansion teams can promise patience. Indiana already proved it. There's also a business side most fans overlook. Playing next to Caitlin Clark isn't just basketball value. It's visibility, national broadcasts, packed arenas, consistent media attention. That matters when endorsement windows are short and brand momentum is fragile. Sophie doesn't need to chase relevance anymore. She's already in one of the most watched situations in the league. Leaving that ecosystem right now, during a growth surge, would have been a gamble. Staying lets her ride the wave instead of restarting the climb. But timing wasn't just about the league. It was personal. Because this wasn't the first time Sophie faced a crossroads like this. It was just the first time she chose certainty over curiosity. And that choice didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a realization that hit her long before free agency talk took over timelines. And that realization started back home. This is where a lot of outside analysis misses the point completely. Sophie Cunningham's decision wasn't just strategic. It was emotional in a way spreadsheets can't measure. When she talked about being back in the Midwest, it wasn't framed like a soundbite. It sounded like relief. That matters. For players who grow up in basketball-heavy regions, the Midwest isn't just geography. It's identity. It's gyms that smell like dust and rubber. It's packed high school bleachers. It's communities that follow careers from AAU to the pros and never stop caring. Sophie didn't just play in Indiana. She reconnected there. That's why her words during the ABC 17 interview landed the way they did. She didn't talk about market size or exposure. She talked about roots, about being around the people she grew up around, about feeling like herself again. That kind of grounding changes how players approach everything. Pressure hits differently when you feel supported instead of evaluated. Mistakes don't spiral the same way. Confidence becomes quieter, steadier. And inside the Fever locker room, that sense of belonging wasn't isolated. By all accounts, Sophie became a culture driver fast. Not because she was the loudest voice, but because she brought edge without ego, fire without friction. That's why her relationship with teammates matters more than most fans realize. The Caitlin Clark connection wasn't just viral clips and jokes online. It was trust built in real time. Spacing, timing, knowing where the other would be without looking. That doesn't develop overnight, and it doesn't travel easily. Then there's Lexi Hull. The catty jokes weren't random. They reflected genuine comfort. Players don't clown each other publicly unless there's real chemistry underneath it. And when Sophie went out of her way to highlight Kelsey Mitchell, that wasn't PR. That was leadership. Mitchell carried the team through injuries, took defensive pressure, 8 tough possessions. Sophie acknowledging that publicly reinforced something crucial inside the locker room. This wasn't about individual shine. It was about shared survival. That's rare in a league where careers can hinge on single seasons. So when Sophie said the Fever locker room was one of those rare groups that genuinely loved each other, people who've been around pro sports recognized the truth immediately. Those rooms don't come around often. And when you find one, you don't walk away lightly. Especially not when you believe the ceiling hasn't been hit yet. Which brings us to the part that really changed everything, because staying wasn't just about comfort. It was about unfinished business. On the surface, staying with Indiana looked safe. But dig a little deeper, and it was anything but. Leaving would have been easy. Expansion teams are desperate. Cap sheets are flexible. A player with Sophie Cunningham's edge, visibility, and two-way impact could have walked into a bigger role overnight. New market, new attention, new storyline built entirely around her. That path was right there, which is exactly why staying mattered more. Sophie didn't stay because Indiana was convenient. She stayed because she saw something forming that most players would have gambled away too early. This Fever roster isn't just talented. It's aligned. Caitlin Clark bends coverage in ways that change spacing before the ball even crosses half court. Aaliyah Boston anchors the paint with calm authority. Kelsey Mitchell absorbs pressure without shrinking. Lexi Hull does the dirty work without needing credit. Sophie fits into that ecosystem like a pressure valve. She brings edge when things get flat. She brings noise when games get quiet. She takes defensive matchups personally. And when momentum swings, she doesn't hesitate. That role is powerful, but it only works in the right environment. On a new team, she would have had to establish that identity from scratch. New locker room politics, new hierarchy, new expectations. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it burns seasons you don't get back. In Indiana, the foundation was already there. More importantly, Sophie didn't just see what the team was. She saw what it could be if it stayed intact. That's why her comments about the CBA weren't throwaway lines. They were signals. She wasn't ignoring the uncertainty. She was acknowledging it and still choosing commitment. That matters in a league where instability has pushed players to chase short-term security for years. Sophie essentially said, "I believe in this core enough to ride the turbulence." That's not loyalty for loyalty's sake. That's belief. And belief changes how teams operate. When a player publicly commits like that, it sends a message internally. It stabilizes things. It gives younger players confidence. It pressures the front office to protect continuity. Suddenly, the Fever aren't just assembling talent. They're building gravity. And gravity attracts the right kind of decisions. Which is why this moment wasn't just about Sophie Cunningham staying in Indiana. It was about Indiana becoming a place players choose, not settle for. And once that shift happens, the league notices. Because what comes next isn't speculation anymore. It's expectation. Once Sophie made her position clear, the conversation quietly changed across the league. Not publicly, not in headlines, but in front offices. Because this wasn't just about one player choosing to stay. It was about why she stayed, and what that said about Indiana's trajectory. WNBA teams understand leverage. They know when a player is chasing opportunity, and they know when a player is choosing alignment. Sophie Cunningham just told everyone which one mattered more to her. That raised eyebrows. Around the league, Indiana had long been viewed as a rebuilding project. Promising, yes, but still forming. Still theoretical. A team you watch, not a team you fear. Sophie's decision challenged that perception. This was a veteran with options. A player whose value had peaked at the exact moment expansion chaos created leverage. And instead of cashing that leverage in, she doubled down on continuity. Front offices notice patterns like that. Because players talk. Agents talk. And once word spreads that a locker room is real, not just talented, but functional, everything shifts. This is how contenders form before banners exist. It's not the highlights. It's not the marketing. It's the quiet decisions players make when nobody's forcing their hand. Sophie's choice also reframed the Fever's internal timeline. Instead of asking, who do we protect? The question became, who do we build around? That's a massive distinction. Protection is defensive. Building is intentional. And once that shift happens, roster decisions stop being reactive. They become directional. You don't just fill gaps. You protect chemistry. You prioritize fit. You resist panic moves. That's how windows open. It also put pressure on the rest of the league, especially expansion teams who assumed Sophie would be one of the faces they could sell immediately. That plan evaporated overnight. Now those teams had to pivot, reevaluate, and recalibrate without one of the most visible, emotionally connective players available. Meanwhile, Indiana gained something far more valuable than cap flexibility. They gained credibility. Credibility with players. Credibility with agents. Credibility with fans who now see a team players believe in. And that credibility compounds. Because the next time a free agent is deciding between a bigger role somewhere else or a chance to win with real chemistry, Sophie's decision becomes a reference point. Look at Indiana. That sentence carries weight now. And that's when staying stops looking safe. It starts looking strategic. Here's the part most people are still underestimating. Sophie Cunningham staying doesn't just stabilize the Fever, it accelerates their timeline. Indiana is no longer operating on a slow rebuild clock. That clock quietly sped up the moment veterans stopped treating the roster as temporary. When players with leverage choose continuity over escape routes, it's a sign the internal belief has already shifted from development to expectation. And expectation changes everything. Championship windows don't open when teams announce them. They open when the locker room starts behaving like the margin for error is shrinking. Sophie's role is critical here because she exists in the space between stars and structure. She's not the franchise centerpiece, but she's the piece that keeps the floor from collapsing when pressure hits. Every contender has one. Sometimes two. Think about playoff basketball. Rotations tighten. Schemes get exposed. Stars get targeted. Games swing on momentum, not just talent. That's where players like Sophie matter most. She guards up. She spaces without disappearing. She absorbs physical matchups that wear down opponents. And she brings an edge that doesn't fade when the moment gets uncomfortable. Indiana didn't just keep a scorer. They kept elasticity. That elasticity allows Caitlin Clark to play free instead of forcing hero shots. It allows Aaliyah Boston to anchor without carrying every emotional burden in the paint. It allows Kelsey Mitchell to attack without needing to be perfect every possession. When Sophie is on the floor, the Fever don't just run plays, they survive chaos. That's the difference between a promising team and a dangerous one. It also hints at something bigger behind the scenes. Front offices don't operate in isolation. If Sophie felt confident committing, it suggests conversations happened quietly. Conversations about vision, about role clarity, about how this core is expected to grow together. Not reset every year. You don't stake your prime on uncertainty unless you believe the people above you know exactly what they're doing. That belief doesn't come from words. It comes from patterns. Indiana's pattern is changing. The league still sees the Fever as young. What Sophie just confirmed is that they're also ready. And once readiness meets belief, the window isn't years away. It's already opening. There's another layer to this decision that never shows up in transaction graphics. Sophie Cunningham didn't just make a move for the league. She made a move for her teammates. Inside a locker room, players read actions louder than contracts. And when a veteran with options chooses to stay, it does something subtle but powerful to the internal dynamic. It removes doubt. Young players stop wondering if this is a temporary stop. Stars stop feeling like they're carrying the future alone. Role players stop playing like they're auditioning for somewhere else. Everything steadies. For Caitlin Clark, that matters more than people realize. Being the focal point of attention brings pressure that doesn't always show up on the stat sheet. When veterans buy into the vision instead of circling exits, it lightens that weight. It tells the face of the franchise, you're not building this by yourself. For Aaliyah Boston, it reinforces trust. Trust that the interior doesn't have to do all the emotional anchoring. Trust that the perimeter will fight just as hard when games tilt. And for Kelsey Mitchell, Sophie's public commitment quietly validated something important. That what she held together during injury stretches and uneven nights mattered. That leadership without noise gets noticed internally, even if it doesn't always dominate headlines. This is how real chemistry forms. Not from speeches, not from slogans, but from players choosing each other when nobody is forcing them to. Sophie also sent a message about accountability. By staying, she tied her reputation to the outcome. No escape hatch. No easy pivot if things stall. When you do that, it raises standards, because now effort, focus, and execution are personal. You don't commit to a core and then coast. You commit and you demand. That edge is part of Sophie's identity, and now it's baked deeper into Indiana's culture. This is why teams that look good on paper still fall apart, and why teams with fewer stars sometimes punch far above their weight. Belief plus accountability creates friction. Friction sharpens teams. The Fever didn't just keep a player. They deepened an identity. And identities don't show up in standings until it's too late for opponents to adjust. What looks calm right now? That's pressure quietly building. Here's the part most people missed while focusing on headlines and quotes. Sophie Cunningham staying didn't just affect this season. It shifted Indiana's entire competitive clock. Before this decision, the Fever's timeline looked fragile. Promising, but fragile. A young core. Massive expectations. A fan base exploding overnight. That combination can either accelerate growth or crack a team before it's ready. Veteran stability decides which direction it goes. By committing now, Sophie effectively told the organization, you don't have to rush this. Indiana doesn't need to gamble on quick fixes or panic trades. They don't need to overextend contracts just to look aggressive. They can let Caitlin Clark grow into leadership instead of forcing it. They can let Aaliyah Boston expand her offensive responsibilities without burning her out. They can let chemistry mature instead of manufacturing it. That patience is rare in a league where momentum feels fragile. And make no mistake, the Fever are being watched differently now. Free agents notice when veterans stay. Agents notice when players talk about culture instead of leverage. Front offices notice when a locker room looks stable instead of transactional. This decision quietly made Indiana more attractive, not less. It also reframed expectations internally. Championships stop being abstract goals and start becoming shared responsibilities. When a veteran chooses continuity over flexibility, the message is clear. The window isn't theoretical anymore. It's opening. That changes how practices feel, how film sessions hit, how late-game mistakes are addressed. The room tightens up, not out of fear, but out of urgency. And there's another layer that matters just as much. Sophie staying removed one of the easiest excuses young teams lean on. Though we're still figuring it out, phase doesn't last as long when experienced voices commit fully. Growth is still allowed, but drifting is not. That's a dangerous combination for the rest of the league. Because teams don't usually announce when they're about to take a leap. They show it through alignment. Right now, Indiana is aligned. And alignment is what turns hype into habits, and habits into wins. There's a conversation that never shows up in interviews, never gets clipped for social media. But every player in that locker room heard it loud and clear. When Sophie chose to stay, she wasn't just talking to the front office. She was talking to her teammates. In professional sports, words are cheap. Contracts, time, and commitment aren't. And veterans know that younger players watch decisions more than speeches. They watch who leaves when things get complicated. They watch who stays when the future isn't guaranteed. This decision landed differently because it answered a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Is this real, or is this temporary? By staying, Sophie turned belief into proof. For Caitlin Clark, that matters more than most people realize. Being the center of attention is easy. Being the center of accountability isn't. When veterans opt in instead of opting out, it removes the pressure of carrying a franchise alone. It turns leadership into something shared instead of imposed. For Aaliyah Boston, it reinforces trust. Bigs feel everything through rhythm and spacing. Knowing your perimeter pieces are locked and lets you expand your game without hesitation. Confidence shows up in touches, angles, and timing. Stability gives you permission to grow. For role players, the message was even louder. This wasn't a pit stop. This wasn't a rebuild experiment. This was a place people choose. That changes how players approach their jobs. Loose effort tightens. Margins shrink. The little things start to matter more because now the work feels permanent instead of provisional. And there's something else that doesn't get enough attention. Sophie staying neutralized potential fracture points before they ever formed. Free agency often creates invisible tension. Players wondering who's next to leave, who's committed, who's quietly shopping options. That tension erodes trust long before the season starts. Indiana avoided that. No guessing. No side conversations. No silent doubts. Just clarity. And clarity is oxygen for young teams. It allows honest feedback without fear. It allows mistakes without panic. It allows standards to rise without resentment. This is how culture actually forms, not through slogans, but through decisions that remove uncertainty. And once uncertainty leaves the room, expectations get heavier, which leads directly to the next question the Fever can no longer avoid. Once uncertainty disappears, something else takes its place. Expectation. By choosing to stay, Sophie didn't just preserve chemistry, she raised the bar for everyone involved. Stability sounds comfortable from the outside, but inside a locker room, it sharpens everything. When the core stays intact, excuses vanish. No more, we're still figuring it out. No more new pieces need time. No more wait until next year. That grace period is gone. Indiana is no longer a feel-good story about promise and potential. It's a team with continuity, star power, and now accountability. And accountability is heavier than hype. Every practice gets louder. Every film session gets more honest. Every loss feels less forgivable. For Caitlin Clark, this is the first time in her professional career where the narrative fully flips. She's no longer just the spark. She's now the standard. When veterans commit, they're implicitly saying, this is a place worth building around. That puts a different kind of spotlight on the player at the center. Leadership stops being optional. And Caitlin knows that. What's interesting is how Sophie's presence changes how that leadership looks. This isn't a young roster being dragged forward by one transcendent talent. It's a group choosing alignment. That makes leadership collaborative instead of isolating. It creates a structure where calling someone out doesn't feel personal. It feels necessary. But here's where pressure quietly intensifies. With stability comes scouting. With scouting comes game planning. With game planning comes resistance. Teams won't approach Indiana the same way anymore. No more experimental coverages. No more, let's see what they do. Opponents will target habits, test patience, and force uncomfortable adjustments. And they'll do it early. Because continuity makes tendencies visible. The Fever are stepping into a phase where wins won't come from talent alone. They'll come from execution, discipline, and how quickly they adapt when Plan A gets taken away. That's the moment where teams either mature or fracture. Sophie staying accelerates that timeline. She didn't buy time. She eliminated it. And while fans celebrate loyalty, the locker room understands the trade-off. Staying together means growing up fast. It means pressure doesn't wait for readiness. It arrives immediately and demands answers. Which leads to the most overlooked part of this decision. Because not everyone thrives once the noise turns inward. There's a phase every rising team goes through that fans rarely notice. It's the moment when attention stops working as a shield and starts acting like a magnifying glass. For Indiana, that moment is now. Last season, the Fever could make mistakes without punishment. Missed rotations were chalked up to youth. Late-game confusion was framed as learning curves. Even losses carried optimism because the story was still forming. That cushion is gone.